The underground parking garage of Morrison Tower smelled of concrete and expensive cologne. James Morrison's Italian leather shoes clicked against polished stone as he approached his midnight blue Bentley, checking his Patek Philippe. 10:47 p.m. Another deal closed. Another million secured. At 42, he'd mastered the art of profit without attachment, building an empire while keeping everyone at arm's length. Then he heard it. A sharp cry. The sickening sound of flesh meeting concrete. 20 years of calculated indifference screamed at him to walk away. Call 911 from the safety of his car if he felt civic-minded. But something, perhaps the desperate quality of that cry, rooted him in place. He turned. Between concrete pillars, illuminated by harsh fluorescent light, a pregnant black woman pressed herself against a Mercedes SUV, hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. Above her loomed a man in an expensive suit, fist raised, rage radiating from every line of his body. James took a step forward, not knowing this single choice would cost him everything he'd spent a lifetime building. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us share more powerful stories. You embarrassed me in front of the Hendersons. The man's voice echoed through the garage like a gunshot. Do you have any idea what your behavior cost me tonight? The woman, late 20s, professional clothes now disheveled, whimpered. Paul, please. The baby. James Morrison had built his fortune on reading people, on calculating risk versus reward in microseconds. The spreadsheet in his mind usually delivered clear answers. Stay out of it, protect your assets, minimize liability. But looking at this woman's terrified eyes, at her protective stance over her unborn child, something in that cold calculation fractured. Step away from her. His voice carried the same authority he used to close billion-dollar deals. Paul Henderson, James recognized him now, senior partner at Morrison & Associates, the firm that handled his company's litigation, turned slowly. His expression shifted from fury to contempt as he assessed James's tailored Tom Ford suit, the Bentley key fob visible in his hand. Mind your business, Paul said, voice dripping with privilege. This is between me and my wife. I'm making it my business. James pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the security contact. You have 5 seconds before I call building security and every board member in your firm. Paul's jaw clenched. For a moment, James saw past the expensive veneer to something darker, a man who viewed everything, including his wife, as property to control. Paul's eyes darted between James and the woman, calculating odds. This isn't over, Linda, he finally hissed, jabbing a finger at his wife. You're coming home tonight, or I'll make you regret it. He straightened his tie with deliberate precision, reconstructing his mask of civility. And you, he turned to James, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Paul's footsteps echoed as he disappeared toward the elevator. The silence that followed felt heavier than the confrontation. James approached cautiously, the way he might approach a wounded animal. Are you hurt? Should I call an ambulance? Linda shook her head, but James could see the bruise blooming on her cheekbone, the way she trembled while still maintaining the protective stance over her belly. 7 months pregnant, he estimated. Her eyes, intelligent, weary, resigned, met his with a complex expression that held gratitude and something that looked like pity. Thank you, she whispered, her voice rough. But you shouldn't have interfered. Paul has powerful friends. He'll make your life very difficult. The words should have triggered his usual response. Cut losses, maintain distance, protect assets. Instead, James heard himself ask, Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight? Linda's laugh was bitter, broken. Every time I leave, he finds me. My sister's apartment. He showed up with police, claimed I was mentally unstable, having a breakdown. Hotels. He tracks my credit cards. Shelters. She touched her belly. He has connections everywhere. Corporate lawyer with judges and cops on speed dial. She wiped tears from her face with trembling fingers, straightening despite obvious exhaustion. I should go before he comes back with backup. Paul doesn't lose. Ever. James looked at this woman, this stranger whose name he just learned, and made a decision that defied every principle of his carefully constructed life. Come with me. Linda's eyes widened. What? My penthouse. Top floor. No one gets past security without my personal authorization. He heard the words coming from his mouth and barely recognized himself. At least for tonight. Until we figure something out. We. Linda's expression shifted between hope and disbelief. You don't even know me. Why would you risk? Because someone should, James said simply, surprising himself with the truth of it. The penthouse suite atop Morrison Tower had never felt so cavernous. 43rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city, every surface reflecting his success. Original artwork, Italian marble, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. James had designed it to impress clients, to showcase achievement. Now, watching Linda stand by those windows, one hand still protectively covering her belly, he saw it differently, a monument to isolation. I can't stay here, Linda said quietly, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Paul will find out. He always does. James set 2 glasses of water on the marble counter. He'd almost poured wine before remembering her condition, another reminder of how unprepared he was for this situation. This building has security protocols that would make Fort Knox jealous. Biometric scanners, 24-hour monitoring, ex-Secret Service personnel. No one reaches this floor without my explicit authorization. Linda turned from the window, her expression mixing hope and exhaustion. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Paul isn't just angry. He's methodical, calculating. He'll find a way. Then let's be more methodical, James replied, falling back on the one thing he understood: strategy. Tell me everything. Over the next 2 hours, Linda's story emerged in painful fragments. She'd met Paul Henderson 5 years ago when she was a graduate student in architecture at Columbia, brilliant and full of dreams about designing sustainable housing for underserved communities. Paul had seemed perfect, successful, attentive, interested in her ideas. The red flags started small, checking her phone because he worried, questioning friendships with male classmates, suggesting she didn't need to work so hard on her degree when they could build a life together. By the time I realized what was happening, I was financially dependent, Linda explained, her voice flat with exhaustion. He convinced me to quit my program, said he'd support my dreams after we were established. Then it was always next year, or after the wedding, or once things settled down. She twisted her wedding ring, a simple gold band that looked cheap against the opulent surroundings. The first time he hit me, he cried after. Swore it would never happen again. Blamed stress from a case he was losing. I believed him. James recognized the pattern from hostile takeovers he'd witnessed in business. Isolate the target, create dependence, and manufacture crises to justify control. The other escape attempts? First time, I made it to my sister's place in Brooklyn. Paul showed up with 2 police officers, showed them psychiatric evaluations claiming I was having a breakdown, needed to be hospitalized for my own safety. The evaluations were fake, but they looked official. My sister believed him. thought she was helping me. Linda's voice cracked. I was committed for 72-hour observation. By the time I was released, Paul had convinced everyone I was fragile, unstable. Second attempt. James asked gently. Made it 3 days in a women's shelter. Paul found me through credit card tracking. I'd used my card at a grocery store nearby. He didn't drag me out. Just visited. Brought flowers. Talked to the shelter director about his sick wife and how worried he was. Left legal papers showing he was petitioning for guardianship due to my mental state. She rubbed her swollen belly absently. I went back because the shelter director suggested it might be best for my condition. And the third attempt? Linda's hand stilled on her belly. I found out I was pregnant. For a few weeks, I thought maybe a baby would change things. That becoming a father would make him see what he was doing. Her laugh was hollow. Instead, it got worse. More controlling. More violent. He said the pregnancy made me hormonal, irrational. That I needed to be protected from myself. James felt cold fury building. Not the hot anger that clouded judgment, but the calculated kind that fueled strategy. The beating tonight? Fundraiser dinner for his firm. I talked to a judge. Just professional conversation about housing policy. Paul thought I was embarrassing him by speaking without his permission, by showing off my education. Linda touched the bruise on her cheek. This was just the preview. The real punishment would have come at home. She looked directly at James, her intelligent eyes seeing past his wealth to something deeper. I'm telling you all this so you understand. Paul doesn't give up. He's systematic. He'll destroy anyone who gets between him and what he considers his. You intervened tonight, which means you're now his enemy. James thought about his empire, the company he'd built from nothing, the deals that had made him wealthy beyond imagination, the carefully constructed reputation that opened doors across 3 continents. He'd spent 20 years building walls around himself, avoiding exactly this kind of messy human entanglement. Then we'll need to be more systematic than he is, James said finally. Linda studied him with something like wonder. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You're risking everything for a stranger. It was a fair question. James Morrison didn't do anything without calculating return on investment. But looking at Linda, at her protective stance over her unborn child, at the bruises marking her resilience, at the intelligence still shining through exhaustion, he recognized something he'd spent 2 decades avoiding, a reason to care about something beyond profit margins. Maybe I'm tired of building empires that don't mean anything, he heard himself say. Morning arrived with consequences. James's assistant, Margaret Chen, fierce, brilliant, and utterly unflappable, burst into his office at 7:15 a.m., tablet in hand, her usual composure fractured. "We have a situation," she announced, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "Paul Henderson filed for an emergency restraining order against you at 6 a.m. claims you're holding his mentally unstable pregnant wife against her will. He's also filed a formal complaint with the building management alleging you're using your position to prevent him from accessing his wife." James felt the cold calculation he'd built his career on clicking into place. "Show me." The documents were thorough, professional, devastating. Paul had attached psychiatric evaluations dating back 2 years, documenting Linda's increasingly erratic behavior and paranoid delusions. Statements from her former employer at the architecture firm claimed she'd become unreliable and emotionally volatile. Affidavits from neighbors describing concerning behavior and welfare checks they'd requested. Even a statement from Linda's sister expressing grave concerns about her mental state. "It's all fabricated," James said, scrolling through the carefully constructed narrative. "Probably," Margaret agreed. "But it's expertly fabricated by someone who knows exactly how the legal system works. And there's more." She pulled up another document. "Henderson's firm sent a letter an hour ago. They're threatening litigation for alienation of affection, intentional interference with marital relations, and defamation. They're also notifying the board that you're involved in ethically compromised behavior that could impact the company." James set down the tablet, mind racing through scenarios. "Get Amanda Chen on the phone. Tell her I need to see her within the hour, whatever it costs." Already done. "She's waiting in conference room A." Amanda Chen was precisely the lawyer James needed. Ruthless, strategic, and utterly unfazed by powerful men's threats. At 48, she'd built a reputation dismantling the cases of abusers who hid behind wealth and connections. But even her assessment was sobering. "Henderson is good," she said, spreading documents across the conference table. "He's created a paper trail that makes Linda look unstable, and you look like you're taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. In family court, perception is often reality. We need hard evidence of abuse, not just your testimony about one incident." "What about the bruises?" James demanded. "The hospital records from her previous injuries?" "He's explained those. Falls, clumsiness exacerbated by pregnancy, one incident where she claims she was mugged but refused to file a police report, which he's spinning as evidence of paranoid behavior." Amanda's expression was grim. Every injury has a documented explanation that paints her as either accident-prone or manufacturing drama. James thought about Linda upstairs in his penthouse, finally sleeping after a night spent watching the door like a trapped animal expecting attack. "There has to be something." "There is," Amanda said. "But it's going to take time, investigation, and exposure that might damage both of you in the process. We need to document patterns, find other victims if they exist, build a case that shows systematic abuse. In the meantime, Henderson will use every legal tool available to destroy your credibility and force Linda back under his control." "How long?" "Months. Maybe longer." Amanda met his eyes directly. "And it's going to cost you, James. Not just money, reputation, business relationships, possibly the company itself. Board members don't like controversy. Clients don't like uncertainty. Henderson will make sure everyone knows you're unstable, making erratic decisions, letting personal entanglements affect your judgment." James stood, moving to the window overlooking the city he'd conquered through careful calculation and emotional distance. Somewhere down there, Paul Henderson was orchestrating his counterattack with the same precision James had used to build his empire. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Do it," he said finally. "Whatever it takes." "Are you sure?" Amanda's tone was gentle, almost maternal. "You're talking about potentially losing everything you've built. For someone you met last night." James thought about that question. Was he sure? The logical answer was no. This was financial suicide, reputational disaster, strategic insanity. But logic had governed his life for 20 years, and what had it given him? Success, yes. Wealth beyond measure. And a penthouse so empty it echoed with loneliness. "I'm sure," he said. The situation deteriorated with surgical precision over the next week. James watched his carefully constructed empire begin to crack as Paul Henderson deployed every weapon in his considerable arsenal. Day 3, Morrison and Associates, Paul's firm, sent official notice they were terminating their relationship with James's company, citing irreconcilable conflicts of interest. That afternoon, 3 other law firms that handled various aspects of his business operations sent similar notices. Legal representation he'd cultivated over 15 years evaporated in hours. Day 5. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Gerald Thompson, the longest-serving member and James's mentor, delivered the news with obvious discomfort. "There are concerns about your judgment, James. This situation with Henderson's wife, some members feel it demonstrates instability. There's talk of a vote to replace you as CEO." "Based on what?" James demanded. "Helping someone being beaten in our own parking garage?" "Based on Henderson's documentation suggesting this is part of a pattern of erratic behavior," Thompson replied carefully. "He's provided the board with concerning information about your recent decisions, alleged financial irregularities." "All lies." "Probably. But we have fiduciary responsibility to investigate. The optics alone could affect stock prices, investor confidence." Thompson's voice softened. "I've known you 15 years, James. This isn't like you. Maybe you should consider stepping back, letting this blow over." "By abandoning Linda to her abuser?" James cut him off. "That's not happening." Day 7. 3 major clients withdrew their accounts, collectively representing $47 million in annual revenue. The press release cited concerns about leadership stability and preference for firms with less controversial management. James's phone lit up with messages from business partners suddenly too busy to meet, investors requesting clarification about recent events. Margaret showed him the financial projections that evening. "At this rate, we're looking at potential losses exceeding $200 million within 6 months. The board will force you out within 30 days unless something changes dramatically." James studied the spreadsheets, his native language, numbers that usually told clear stories about profit and loss. Now they told the story of a man choosing compassion over calculation and paying the price. "What do you think?" he asked Margaret. She'd been with him since the beginning, knew him better than anyone. "I think you're either having a breakdown or becoming a human being. Haven't decided which yet." She smiled slightly. "Either way, I'm staying. Someone needs to manage the disaster." Linda found him that evening on the penthouse balcony, the city lights spreading below like a constellation of possibilities and threats. She'd been staying in the guest suite, barely sleeping, moving through the space like a ghost convinced of her temporary welcome. "I heard Margaret on the phone," she said quietly, joining him at the railing. "The board meeting. The client's leaving. Paul's doing exactly what he promised, destroying everything you've built." James didn't deny it. "He's effective, I'll give him that. You should let me go." Linda's voice was steady despite the pain in it. "This isn't your fight. I'm not worth losing everything." James turned to look at her directly. In the weeks since that night in the parking garage, Linda had begun to look less hunted, more like the person she'd been before Paul's systematic destruction. Her intelligence showed in every conversation, her dry humor emerging in unexpected moments, her architectural eye noting details in his space that he'd never consciously seen. "What's your company worth?" she asked when he didn't respond. "On paper, about $800 million. And you're risking all of it for someone you met a week ago." Linda shook her head, disbelief and wonder mixing in her expression. "That's insane, James." "Probably," he agreed. "But I've been sane my entire life, and it made me rich and empty. Maybe insanity is an improvement." Linda laughed, a real sound that lit something in her eyes. That's definitely insane logic. They stood in companionable silence, watching the city breathe below them. Finally, Linda spoke again. I was studying sustainable architecture before Paul. Wanted to design housing for people who couldn't afford the kind of place where we're standing right now. Believed good design should be accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy. Why did you stop? Paul convinced me it wasn't practical, that I was being naive, that if I really cared about helping people, I should focus on supporting his career instead. He made real money, real impact. She touched her belly, where the baby shifted visibly. By the time I realized he was right about the money but wrong about everything else, I was trapped. James thought about his own journey, the poor kid from Queens who'd built an empire through ruthless calculation, who'd convinced himself that accumulating wealth was the same as building something meaningful. What would you design now? He asked. If you could start over? Linda's eyes brightened with passion he'd only glimpsed before. Safe houses. Real ones, not institutional shelters. Places designed with trauma-informed architecture, natural light, secure but not prison-like, spaces that feel like homes because women healing from abuse need to remember what home should feel like. She paused, seeming embarrassed by her enthusiasm. Sorry. Architecture nerd showing. Don't apologize. James felt an idea forming, the kind of strategic vision that had built his company. What if we did that? Did what? Built those safe houses. After this is over, after we deal with Paul, what if we actually built what you're describing? Linda studied him carefully. You're serious. I'm always serious about good ideas. And I have $800 million that apparently isn't doing anything meaningful. James smiled slightly. Maybe instead of losing it defending against Paul's lawsuits, we should invest it in something that actually matters. That's possibly the most expensive midlife crisis pivot I've ever heard of, Linda said, but she was smiling too. I prefer to think of it as strategic reallocation of assets toward higher-yield emotional returns. Still insane, Linda said. But maybe the good kind. The breaking point came on day 12. James was in his office reviewing Amanda Chen's preliminary investigation findings. They'd located 2 other women who'd been involved with Paul Henderson before Linda, both with similar stories of escalating control and abuse, both too terrified to testify publicly. When Margaret appeared in his doorway, her expression unreadable. Linda's sister is here. Says it's urgent. Jennifer Williams looked like an older version of Linda. Same intelligent eyes, same cautious posture of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous emotional territory. But where Linda had begun to shed her hunted expression, Jennifer carried a weight of guilt that showed in every line of her body. I'm sorry, she said before James could even offer her a seat. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought. Paul told me Linda was having delusions, that the pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid. I believed him because he seemed so worried, so caring, and Linda had been acting strange. She was acting strange because she was being abused, James said gently. I know that now. Jennifer's voice broke. Paul came to see me yesterday. Told me Linda was here, that you were manipulating her, keeping her from her family. He wanted me to help him get her back, had legal papers for me to sign, statements about her mental health. She looked up, eyes red. But something he said didn't sit right. He was too smooth, too prepared. So I did what I should have done months ago. I talked to Linda's old roommate from Columbia, the one Paul said was a bad influence. Jennifer pulled out her phone, showing James a series of text messages. Sarah Chen, Linda's friend, she's been keeping records. Photos Linda sent her of injuries. voice messages where you can hear Paul in the background, screenshots of texts from Linda describing incidents. She collected everything because she knew someday Linda might need proof. James felt hope flickering for the first time in days. Why didn't she come forward before? Linda made her promise not to. Said it would only make things worse, that Paul would convince everyone Sarah was the unstable one trying to sabotage their marriage. Jennifer's hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence. But Sarah gave me copies. Said if Linda's finally trying to leave, we need to help her. We need Amanda Chen to see this, James said, already pulling out his phone. There's something else. Jennifer's voice dropped. Paul doesn't know I have this information yet. He thinks I'm on his side. He told me he's planning to have Linda taken into custody tomorrow. Emergency psychiatric hold based on her deteriorating condition. He has a doctor willing to sign off on it, connections with officers who'll enforce it. Once she's committed, he'll petition for emergency guardianship and custody of the baby after it's born. James felt ice forming in his chest. He can't do that. He absolutely can. And he will, unless we move first. Amanda Chen's office became command central. She reviewed Sarah Chen's evidence with the focused intensity of a general planning battle strategy, while Jennifer provided insider information about Paul's network and timeline. This changes everything, Amanda declared. With contemporaneous documentation, photos, messages, witnesses, we can file for an emergency protection order before Paul makes his move. But it has to be tonight. Tomorrow might be too late. What do we need? James asked. Linda's testimony, first and foremost. Medical examination documenting current injuries. Jennifer's statement about Paul's plan. And, Amanda looked at James directly. We need to be prepared for nuclear retaliation. When Paul realizes we're moving against him with real evidence, he'll escalate. It will get ugly. Linda, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. How ugly? He'll come after everyone involved. James, Jennifer, Sarah Chen, me. He'll use every connection, every resource, every dirty trick in the book. Amanda didn't soften the truth. This isn't civil litigation anymore. This is war, and Paul Henderson doesn't fight fair. Linda's hand moved to her belly, where her daughter, they'd learned it was a girl during an ultrasound James had arranged with a trusted private physician, kicked actively. James watched her internal calculation, seeing the same strategic mind that had once dreamed of changing architecture now applying itself to survival. Then we fight, Linda said quietly. But not just defensively. If we're going to war with Paul, we do it to win completely. Not just protection for me and the baby, but consequences for him. Accountability. That's ambitious, Amanda observed. I've been scared for 5 years. I'm done being scared. Linda's voice strengthened. Let's end this. The hearing for the emergency protection order was scheduled for 9 a.m. in family court. Paul Henderson arrived with 3 attorneys from his firm's family law division, projecting confidence and wounded husband concern in equal measure. He'd granted an interview to a sympathetic reporter that morning, painting himself as a desperate man fighting to save his mentally ill wife from a wealthy predator's manipulation. But Amanda Chen had spent the night preparing a presentation that methodically dismantled every lie Paul had constructed. Sarah Chen's evidence provided a timeline that contradicted Paul's documented narrative. Medical experts testified about injury patterns consistent with intimate partner violence. Jennifer's statement revealed Paul's plan to have Linda forcibly committed. James watched Paul's confident expression gradually crack as the evidence mounted. The man who'd seemed so powerful, so untouchable, began to look smaller as his carefully constructed facade crumbled. "Mr. Henderson," the judge said, her voice carrying distinct chill, "did you or did you not tell your sister-in-law that you intended to have your wife involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation?" Paul's lead attorney jumped in. "Your Honor, my client was simply exploring all options for his wife's welfare." "I'm asking Mr. Henderson directly." Paul stood, reconstructing his mask of concerned husband. "Your Honor, I've been desperately worried about Linda's mental health. The pregnancy has exacerbated her paranoid tendencies. I consulted with medical professionals about what options existed to ensure her safety and the safety of our unborn child." "The medical professionals who don't exist?" Amanda Chen interjected, sliding another document across to the judge. "We verified that Dr. Marcus Reynolds, who Mr. Henderson cited in his psychiatric evaluations of Mrs. Henderson, is not a licensed physician in this state. The practice address listed on the evaluations is a vacant office space. The medical license number belongs to a Dr. Martha Reynolds who retired 15 years ago and never practiced psychiatry." The courtroom went silent. James watched Paul's face cycle through shock, rage, and calculation before settling on wounded innocence. "That must be an administrative error. My attorney handled those filings." "Your attorney," the judge said icily, "who happens to be your junior partner, sitting right here. Would counsel for Mr. Henderson like to address these allegations of fraudulent documentation?" The junior partner looked genuinely terrified. "Your Honor, I accepted those documents in good faith from Mr. Henderson. I had no knowledge of any." "Enough." The judge's voice cut through the escalating chaos. "Emergency protection order granted. Mr. Henderson, you are hereby prohibited from any contact with your wife, direct or indirect. You will surrender any weapons in your possession to the bailiff immediately. A full investigation into these allegations of document fraud will be referred to the State Bar and District Attorney's Office." Paul's mask shattered completely. "This is ridiculous. That man," he pointed at James, "has been manipulating my wife, turning her against me. He's wealthy enough to buy false evidence, to pay people to lie." "Mr. Henderson, you're dangerously close to contempt," the judge warned. But Paul was beyond control now, the calculated facade giving way to raw fury. "Linda, you can't do this. That's my child. My family. You belong to me." "I don't belong to anyone," Linda said quietly, standing. Her voice didn't shake. "Not anymore." Security escorted Paul from the courtroom, his attorneys scrambling to control the damage. James watched the man who'd nearly destroyed both their lives being reduced to exactly what he was: a small, cruel person who'd hidden behind power and privilege. The victory should have felt sweet. Instead, James felt exhausted, wrung out by the intensity of the last 2 weeks. As they left the courthouse, Amanda Chen pulled him aside. "This isn't over," she warned. "Paul has resources, connections. He'll appeal, file motions, make allegations. You should prepare for months of legal warfare." "I know," James replied. "But at least now we're fighting on equal terms." "Equal terms." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "James, Paul Henderson is about to lose his legal career, his reputation, possibly face criminal charges. He has nothing left to lose. Those are the most dangerous opponents." Her words proved prophetic faster than any of them anticipated. That night, James received a call from building security. "Mr. Morrison, we have a situation. Paul Henderson is in the lobby, demanding access to the penthouse. He's not making threats, not being physically aggressive, but he's refusing to leave and he's agitated. James glanced at Linda, who'd gone pale. Call the police. Send them up when they arrive. I'm coming down. James, don't, Linda protested. Paul's smart. If he's here, he has a plan. Then we'll find out what it is. The elevator ride down felt interminable. James thought about Amanda's warning, about desperate men with nothing left to lose. He'd spent 20 years learning to read opponents in business negotiations, understanding how cornered enemies behaved when they saw defeat approaching. Paul Henderson stood in the marble lobby, still wearing his courtroom suit, disheveled now. His expensive veneer had cracked completely, revealing something wild underneath. 2 security guards maintained careful distance, hands near their concealed weapons. James Morrison, Paul said, his voice carrying eerie calm. Self-made millionaire. CEO of Morrison Financial Consulting. Net worth $800 million, give or take. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. You know what I discovered? You're just like me. We both built empires by being ruthless, by seeing people as assets or obstacles. I'm nothing like you, James replied evenly. Aren't you? I read about your business practices. The hostile takeovers. The competitors you destroyed. The employees you let go to maximize profits. Paul took a step closer. The only difference is I applied those same principles to my personal life, and you pretended yours mattered less. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. James had spent years justifying his business ruthlessness as separate from his personal ethics, creating a wall between professional calculation and private conscience. Confronting Paul forced him to see how thin that wall had always been. There's a significant difference, James said finally. I'm trying to do better. You're doubling down on cruelty. Paul laughed, a harsh sound. Better. You destroyed my career to play white knight for a woman you barely know. That's not ethics, that's ego. You're no savior, James. You're just another rich man who decided he wanted something I had. I didn't destroy your career, James countered. You did that by systematically abusing your wife and falsifying legal documents. I just made sure people knew about it. The police arrived then, 2 officers who'd clearly been briefed by security. They approached Paul with professional caution, hands near their weapons but not drawing them. Mr. Henderson, the lead officer said, we need you to leave the premises. There's a restraining order in effect. I'm aware, Paul interrupted smoothly, his calculated control reasserting itself. He turned back to James with cold focus. This isn't over. You think you won today, but I'm just getting started. I'll take everything from you the way you took everything from me. And when I'm done, when you're broken and ruined, I'll still find a way to get my family back. That's not going to happen, James said quietly. We'll see. Paul allowed the officers to escort him toward the exit, but called back over his shoulder. Give Linda a message for me. Tell her I'll see her at the hospital when she delivers. Tell her I'm very much looking forward to meeting our daughter. The threat hung in the air long after Paul disappeared into the night. The call came at 2:47 a.m., shattering the fragile peace of James's penthouse. Linda's voice on the phone, tight with pain. Something's wrong. The baby. Contractions are too strong, too early. James was moving before conscious thought kicked in, grabbing keys and phone while calling down to have his driver meet them. Linda emerged from her room doubled over, one hand clutching her belly, the other gripping the doorframe for support. It's too early, she gasped. Only 32 weeks. She's not ready. Mercy General has the best NICU in the state, James said, helping her toward the elevator with careful urgency. She'll be okay. You'll both be okay. The drive through empty streets felt surreal, Linda breathing through contractions in the back seat while James held her hand, offering useless comfort. His mind raced through worst-case scenarios: premature delivery complications, respiratory distress, and developmental issues. All the clinical terminology he'd absorbed from the private physicians they'd consulted couldn't prepare him for the visceral fear of watching Linda suffer. Mercy General's emergency entrance blazed with fluorescent light. An obstetrics team was already waiting. Amanda Chen had thought to call ahead, efficient even in crisis. They whisked Linda away on a gurney, leaving James in the sterile waiting area with nothing but his phone and mounting dread. That's when he saw Paul. Paul Henderson sat in the corner of the waiting room, cleaned up since their lobby confrontation, projecting the perfect image of a concerned father. He smiled when he saw James, a cold expression that promised malice. "Isn't it amazing?" Paul said conversationally, standing to approach. "Hospital policy. They have to notify the father when his wife goes into labor. Emergency contact forms." He held up his phone, showing a text message. "I've been waiting for this call." "You're not going anywhere near her," James said, positioning himself between Paul and the hallway to the delivery rooms. "I have parental rights until a court says otherwise. Emergency protective order or not, that's my child being born." Paul's smile widened. "And there's not a damn thing you can do about it." James pulled out his own phone, speed dialing Amanda Chen. At 3 a.m., she answered on the second ring. Lawyers fighting custody battles never truly slept. "Paul's here at the hospital," James said without preamble. "Says he has right to be present for delivery." "He doesn't," Amanda replied, her voice sharp with alertness. "The EPO specifically prohibits contact. I'm calling the hospital's legal counsel now. Do not let him near Linda's room." Paul was already moving toward the obstetrics wing, that calculated confidence back in every step. "You going to physically stop me, James? Assault me in a hospital hallway? That'll look great for your case." Two security guards materialized, younger than James would have liked, uncertain in their expressions. "Mr. Henderson," one began, "we've been instructed." "I'm the father," Paul interrupted, producing his driver's license and marriage certificate. "Unless you have a court order saying otherwise, hospital policy requires you to allow me access to my wife during delivery." The guards exchanged glances. James recognized the calculation happening. Policy versus ethics, liability versus conscience. Paul had chosen his battlefield perfectly. A moment of institutional confusion where procedure trumped protection. "There is a court order," James said, pulling up the emergency protective order on his phone. "Judge Martinez issued it yesterday. No contact means no contact." "That order was filed in family court for civil proceedings," Paul countered smoothly. "Parental rights in medical emergencies fall under different jurisdiction. I've already consulted with hospital counsel. They confirmed I have right of access unless specifically prohibited by medical order, not civil court." He was right. James saw it in the security guards' expressions, in the way they stepped back slightly, unwilling to overstep their authority. Paul had found the loophole, the gap in protection that men like him always found. "I'll make this simple," Paul said, his voice dropping to a tone only James could hear. "I'm going to walk down that hallway. I'm going to be present when my daughter is born. And there's nothing you, your expensive lawyers, or your righteous indignation can do about it. Because the system, the one you thought you could use against me, still protects Father's rights above everything else. James felt the helplessness of that moment, the realization that money and moral certainty couldn't overcome institutional gaps. He thought about Linda, vulnerable and in pain, about to face her abuser at her most defenseless moment. Then the door to the obstetrics wing opened, and Dr. Sarah Williams emerged, the same physician who'd attended Linda's initial examination after the parking garage incident. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority, "I'm the attending physician for your wife's delivery. Before you proceed, I need you to accompany me to a consultation room. Hospital policy requires I discuss certain medical findings with you." Paul's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. "What findings?" "Privacy regulations prevent me from discussing patient information in public corridors." Dr. Williams gestured toward a nearby examination room. "After you." James watched the exchange with growing hope. Dr. Williams met his eyes briefly, a flash of understanding passing between them, before following Paul into the consultation room and closing the door. 5 minutes later, Paul emerged ashen-faced. He looked at James with an expression mixing rage and something that might have been fear. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He turned and walked quickly toward the exit. James found Dr. Williams still in the consultation room, making notes on her tablet. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she replied calmly. "That during intake examination, I documented injuries consistent with ongoing intimate partner violence. That I'm filing a mandatory abuse report with social services. That the hospital has protocols for protecting patients from domestic violence, including prohibiting abuser access during vulnerable medical procedures. And that if he attempted to enter Mrs. Henderson's room against her explicit refusal of his presence, I would document it as harassment and have him arrested for violating the protective order." "Would that hold up legally?" Dr. Williams smiled slightly. "Maybe. Maybe not. But Paul Henderson isn't a man who takes risks when the odds aren't clearly in his favor. I gave him enough doubt to make retreat look strategic." "Thank you," James said, feeling overwhelming gratitude for this woman who'd stepped into the gap when institutions failed. "Don't thank me yet. Linda's in premature labor at 32 weeks. The next few hours are critical." Dr. Williams's expression sobered. "You should know, she's asking for you. Said you're the closest thing to family she has right now." The delivery room was a controlled chaos of medical expertise and urgent calm. Linda lay on the bed, monitors tracking her vitals and the baby's heart rate, which kept dipping into concerning ranges. James stood by her head, one hand gripped in hers with surprising strength for someone so exhausted. "You don't have to be here," Linda gasped between contractions. "This is, God, this is messy and scary and not your responsibility." "I'm exactly where I should be," James replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with a cool cloth a nurse had provided. Dr. Williams worked with focused intensity, conferring in low tones with the neonatal team standing ready. "Linda, the baby's heart rate is showing distress. We need to do an emergency C-section. I need your consent." "Will she be okay?" Linda's voice cracked with fear. "We have an excellent NICU team ready. Babies born at 32 weeks have very good outcomes with proper care." Dr. Williams squeezed Linda's other hand. "But we need to move now." The next 20 minutes were a blur of surgical precision. James watched from his position by Linda's head as the medical team worked behind a surgical drape. Linda's eyes stayed locked on his, seeking anchor in the storm. "Tell me something," she said, voice tight with fear and epidural numbness. Tell me anything to keep me here." James found himself talking about the first building he'd ever wanted to design. Back when he was 8 years old, before his father died and practical survival replaced childish dreams. "It was a library," he heard himself say. Not just any library, a floating library on the river, with glass walls so you could read while watching water flow past. Completely impractical, impossible engineering, but I sketched it in every notebook I owned. "Why didn't you become an architect?" Linda asked, her words slurring slightly from medication. "Fear," James admitted. "My father died when I was 12. Left my mother with 3 kids and debt. I learned that dreams were luxuries people like us couldn't afford. So I studied finance instead. Practical, secure, profitable. Built a company that made millions. Never designed a single building." "That's sad," Linda said. "All that money, no floating libraries." "Yeah," James agreed, feeling the truth of it. "Pretty sad." "We're ready," Dr. Williams called. "Linda, you're going to feel pressure, but no pain. Your daughter is coming." The first cry, thin, reedy, but undeniably alive, echoed through the delivery room. James felt something in his chest crack open at the sound. The neonatal team moved quickly, assessing and stabilizing, but James caught a glimpse of impossibly tiny perfection. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a face scrunched in newborn indignation. 3 pounds, 4 ounces, a nurse announced. Good respiratory effort for gestational age. Apgar 7, then 9. "Can I see her?" Linda asked, tears streaming down her face. They brought the baby, wrapped in warming blankets, wearing a knit cap that dwarfed her tiny head, close enough for Linda to touch. "Hi, baby girl," Linda whispered. "Hi, Grace. Mommy's here. You're safe now. We're both safe. Grace." The name Linda had chosen weeks earlier, whispering it late at night when she thought James couldn't hear. Grace for the unearned gift of survival, for mercy in the midst of violence, for second chances neither of them had expected. The neonatal team took Grace to the NICU, and Linda sagged with exhaustion as the surgical team completed their work. "Is she really okay?" she asked Dr. Williams. "She's small, but she's a fighter. Like her mother." Dr. Williams smiled. "The NICU will monitor her closely, but her initial signs are very good. You did well, Linda." As they wheeled Linda to recovery, James stayed by her side. She was falling asleep from exhaustion and medication, but her hand still gripped his. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything. For being here when my own family wasn't. For risking everything when you didn't have to." "Get some rest," James said softly. "Grace needs you strong." But Linda was already asleep, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd met her. James found himself in the NICU observation area, watching through glass as nurses tended to Grace in her warming isolette. She was so small, impossibly, heartbreakingly small, but her chest rose and fell with determined rhythm. A fighter, Dr. Williams had said. James understood why. Grace had survived her father's violence in utero, been born too early into a world that wasn't quite ready for her, and was now fighting for every breath. If that wasn't courage, he didn't know what was. "Mr. Morrison?" James turned to find a woman in her 60s, wearing a hospital ID badge identifying her as Carolyn Hughes, Social Services. His stomach tightened. "I need to speak with you about Mrs. Henderson's case," Carolyn said gently. Dr. Williams filed a mandatory abuse report, which triggers our domestic violence protocols. "I've reviewed the documentation, the injuries, the protective order, the evidence presented in family court. I also need to discuss the father's attempted access during delivery. Paul Henderson has no right to that baby, James said immediately. Legally, that's complicated. He's the biological father, which grants certain presumptive rights even with a protective order in place. Carolyn's expression was compassionate but realistic. What I can tell you is that we've flagged Grace's medical records to prevent unauthorized access. Paul Henderson will not be able to visit the NICU without explicit written permission from Linda, regardless of his parental status. That gives us some breathing room. For how long? Until the custody hearing, which will happen within weeks given Grace's medical needs and the pending abuse allegations. Carolyn hesitated. Mr. Morrison, I should tell you, your involvement in this case is unusual. You're not family, not married to Mrs. Henderson, not legally connected to Grace in any way. Yet you're functioning as primary support, making medical decisions in consultation with Linda, essentially acting as family. Is that a problem? James asked, defensive. Actually, it's remarkable. Carolyn smiled slightly. I've been doing this work for 23 years. I've seen a lot of people claim they'll help abuse victims, make big promises, then disappear when things get complicated or expensive or inconvenient. You're still here. That matters. She handed James a folder. Resources for supporting domestic violence survivors, including trauma counseling services, legal advocacy, and long-term housing assistance. Linda's going to need all of it. So will Grace. After Carolyn left, James sat in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, opening the folder. Inside were pamphlets for organizations he'd never heard of, services he'd never needed, an entire infrastructure built to catch people like Linda when they fell. He thought about his $800 million empire, how he'd believed wealth was the ultimate security. But looking at these photocopied resources, funded by donations and grants and volunteers' time, he realized that real security came from people who showed up, who built safety nets instead of towers. His phone buzzed. A text from Amanda Chen. Judge Martinez wants to see us in chambers tomorrow at 10 a.m. Paul's attorneys are requesting emergency custody hearing. We need to prepare. James looked through the glass at Grace, at this tiny human already fighting battles she shouldn't have to face. Then he opened his phone and started typing an email to his board of directors. Subject: Immediate leave of absence. Effective immediately. I'm taking a leave from CEO duties for personal reasons. CFO Roberts will assume acting leadership. I'll remain available for essential decisions, but my immediate priority is a family matter that requires my full attention. Regards, James Morrison. The email was career suicide. The board would interpret it as instability, possibly force him out permanently. Partners would panic. Clients would flee, his empire might crumble. 20 years of building, risked on send. James hit send. The custody hearing 3 weeks later took place in Judge Martinez's courtroom. Same judge who'd issued the emergency protective order, now presiding over Paul Henderson's desperate attempt to reclaim control. Paul's legal team had pivoted strategies. Since the falsified medical records disqualified Paul from claiming Linda was mentally unstable, they now argued that James Morrison was an inappropriate influence who'd coerced Linda into leaving her marriage. That Linda's decision to stay with James demonstrated poor judgment, making her unfit for custody. That Grace deserved a relationship with her biological father despite alleged past issues. Alleged. Amanda Chen's voice cut through the courtroom. Your Honor, the evidence isn't alleged. It's documented, photographed, testified to under oath, and corroborated by multiple witnesses. My client acknowledges that the marriage had difficulties, Paul's lead attorney said smoothly. He's sought anger management counseling and is committed to being a positive presence in his daughter's life. Denying him parental rights based on a difficult period during a stressful pregnancy seems excessive. James watched Paul play the role perfectly, contrite but not broken, acknowledging mistakes while minimizing their severity, painting himself as a man working toward redemption. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and James could see it working on some faces in the courtroom. Then Amanda called her witnesses. First, Dr. Williams, who walked the court through Linda's injuries with clinical precision, explaining injury patterns that told stories of repeated violence, not accidents. Then Sarah Chen, Linda's friend from Colombia, who testified about years of increasingly concerning messages, photos sent in desperate moments, voicemails where Paul could be heard in the background making threats. Then Jennifer Williams, Linda's sister, who tearfully admitted she'd been manipulated into doubting her own sister, described Paul's systematic campaign to isolate Linda from family support. Finally, two other women, Rachel Morrison and Diana Chen, no relation to Amanda or Sarah, who'd both previously been involved with Paul Henderson. Rachel from his law school years, Diana from his first year as an attorney. Both told similar stories: charming courtship, gradual control, escalating abuse. Rachel had escaped after Paul put her in the hospital. Diana had gotten a restraining order that Paul violated 7 times before she fled the state. These women have nothing to gain by testifying, Amanda said. They're here because they want to prevent what happened to them from happening to Grace. Because they want one child not to grow up in a home where violence is normalized. Paul's attorney tried to discredit the testimony. Past relationships were irrelevant. These women were clearly coordinating stories. Where was the hard proof? But Judge Martinez had heard enough. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying judicial weight, "I've reviewed all evidence presented. The pattern emerging is clear and disturbing. This court finds credible evidence of sustained intimate partner violence, systematic isolation, emotional abuse, and attempted control through manipulation of legal and medical systems." Paul's confident facade finally cracked. "Your Honor, I have rights." "You have responsibilities," Judge Martinez interrupted, "which you've abdicated through your actions. I'm terminating your parental rights to Grace Henderson, effective immediately. You're prohibited from any contact with the child or her mother. Furthermore, I'm referring your case to the State Bar for ethics violations related to falsified documents, and to the district attorney for potential criminal charges." The courtroom erupted. Paul's attorneys scrambled for objections, but the judge's gavel silenced them. "We're adjourned." James felt Linda's hand find his under the table, squeezing tight. They'd won. Not just a legal victory, but something more profound: accountability. The system that usually protected men like Paul had, for once, chosen to protect his victims instead. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, asking questions James ignored. But one caught his attention. "Mr. Morrison, you've lost an estimated $300 million since involving yourself in this case. Business partners have distanced themselves, your company's stock has dropped 40%, and you're no longer CEO. Was it worth it?" James thought about Grace, now 5 pounds and thriving in the NICU, scheduled for discharge in another week. About Linda, who'd spent the last 3 weeks sleeping more peacefully than she had in years, slowly remembering how to laugh without looking over her shoulder. About the folder of domestic violence resources Carolyn Hughes had given him, which had sparked an idea growing in his mind. "Ask me again in 6 months," James replied. "I think you'll be surprised by the answer." 6 months later, James stood in what used to be a dilapidated apartment complex on the edge of the city. Now, transformed through $50 million in renovations, it was something entirely new. The Grace Foundation's Pilot Safe House Complex. Linda walked through the space with an architect's eye, pointing out design features she'd insisted on. Natural light in every unit, critical for mental health. Secure entry systems that don't feel like prison. Community spaces that encourage connection without forcing it. Private outdoor areas for kids to play safely. "It's remarkable," James said, watching her transformation over 6 months from hunted survivor to visionary designer. Linda had thrown herself into the project with fierce dedication, completing her architecture degree online while caring for Grace, channeling trauma into purpose. Grace, now 9 months old, hitting every developmental milestone with her mother's determination, played in a nearby infant play area, supervised by one of the Foundation's childcare specialists. She'd inherited Linda's intelligence in her bright, curious eyes, her father's features softened by her mother's warmth. "Rachel Morrison said she wants to move in," Linda reported, referencing one of Paul's other victims. "She's been in 3 different shelters in 2 years, never feeling safe enough to stay. This place, she said, it feels like healing instead of hiding." The Grace Foundation had grown beyond James's initial vision. What started as a single safe house had expanded to 4 locations across 3 states, funded by the liquidation of his business empire. The board had forced him out as CEO 6 weeks after his leave of absence, exactly as he'd predicted. His company was eventually sold to a private equity firm for a fraction of its former value. James walked away with enough money to fund the foundation long-term, but not enough to maintain his former lifestyle. He'd never been happier. "The second phase designs came in," Linda said, pulling up schematics on her tablet. "Transitional housing for women ready to move from emergency shelter to independent living. We're thinking 12 units per complex, designed around community support." Also, her eyes lit up. "I've been talking to other architects about trauma-informed design principles. There's interest in creating a whole new subspecialty focused on building spaces for healing." James reviewed the designs, seeing Linda's vision coming to life. "How much?" "Ballpark. $20 million per complex. We're looking at 5 locations to start." Linda hesitated. "That's most of your remaining liquid assets." "Good," James said simply. "That's what they're for." They walked through the community room, where a support group was meeting. James recognized faces from court testimony, women who'd fought similar battles against men who believed ownership was love. They were laughing about something, sharing a moment of joy that felt hard-won and precious. "James Morrison?" A young woman approached, baby on her hip. "I'm Diana Chen. I testified at your custody hearing." "I remember. Thank you for your courage." "I wanted to tell you," Diana's voice caught. "I've been running from Paul Henderson for 5 years. Moved cities, changed jobs, looked over my shoulder constantly. But I heard what you did, how you stood up to him, and it made me realize I could stop running. Could fight back. Your foundation is helping me file charges against him for violating the old restraining order. There might actually be consequences." After Diana left, Linda squeezed James's hand. "You changed her life." "We changed it," James corrected. "This wasn't me playing hero. This was showing up, being present, working with people who actually know how to help. The network, the lawyers, the doctors, the advocates, they were already doing this work. I just finally paid attention." The foundation's offices occupied the complex's ground floor. James's office was a fraction of the size of his old CEO suite, furnished with IKEA instead of Italian imports. Margaret, his former assistant, had followed him, taking a massive pay cut but gaining something she said was more valuable: work that meant something. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, Margaret announced, appearing in his doorway. "Also, your daughter called." James felt warmth at those words. After 6 months of careful rebuilding, Ellie had started calling again, slowly thawing the freeze that had existed between them. She'd visited the foundation last month, spent an afternoon with Linda talking about architecture and resilience, had held Grace and cried about all the years she'd wasted being angry at her father for not fighting when it turned out he'd just been waiting for the right thing to fight for. The foundation's board meeting included Linda, Amanda Chen, Dr. Williams, Carolyn Hughes, and 3 survivors who'd gone through the program and now helped run it. They reviewed expansion plans, fundraising goals, policy advocacy initiatives. James contributed financial expertise, but he'd learned to listen more than lead, recognizing that people with lived experience knew better than wealthy saviors what actually helped. "One last item," Linda said as the meeting concluded. "James and I want to propose something." James felt his heart rate increase. They'd discussed this privately but hadn't gone public yet. "We're getting married," Linda announced, her hand finding James's across the table. "Not because I need rescuing or because he's my savior, but because somewhere between that parking garage and this moment, we became partners. Friends. Eventually something more." The room erupted in congratulations. Amanda Chen looked suspicious. "Please tell me you have a prenup." "Ironclad," Linda confirmed, grinning. "All foundation assets protected in trust for their intended purpose. Personal assets separate. Everything documented." "Good," Amanda said, relaxing. "Then congratulations, you crazy kids." That evening, James and Linda sat on the foundation building's rooftop garden. Another Linda design feature: green space for residents who'd been trapped indoors for too long. Grace slept in her stroller between them, tiny fist curled around her mother's finger even in sleep. "You know what I realized," Linda said, watching the sunset paint the city gold. "For 5 years with Paul, I felt like I was drowning. Every day, trying to keep my head above water, struggling to breathe. I thought if I could just escape, just survive, that would be enough." "And now?" James asked. "Now I'm designing buildings, helping other women, planning a wedding, raising my daughter without fear." Linda smiled. "I'm not just surviving. I'm actually living. That's what you gave me. Not rescue, permission to build a real life." James thought about his own transformation. 6 months ago, he'd been a millionaire CEO in an empty penthouse, wealthy beyond measure and emotionally bankrupt. Now he had less money, no empire, no corporate power. But he had Linda, had Grace in a way that wasn't biological but felt more real than anything he'd known. Had purpose that extended beyond quarterly earnings. "What you did shocked everyone," Linda said softly, echoing the title James had seen on news articles about their story. A millionaire CEO giving up everything for a pregnant woman he barely knew. That's the narrative they love. "That's not quite right, though," James replied. "It wasn't about giving up anything. It was about finally finding something worth more than money." Linda leaned against his shoulder. Better quote. "Very romantic. I have my moments." Grace stirred, making soft baby sounds that immediately drew both their attention. Linda lifted her daughter, settling Grace against her chest. "Hey, baby girl. Mommy's here." James watched them, this family he'd found by accident, built through crisis, learned to love despite everything. Grace opened her eyes, focusing on James with that intense infant concentration that always made him feel seen in a way boardrooms never had. "You know what we should build next," Linda said, a familiar spark in her voice that meant she was designing something in her head. "Tell me." "A library. On the water. With glass walls so kids can read while watching the river flow." She smiled at his shocked expression. "You talked about it during my delivery. Before the drugs fully kicked in, I remember. You sounded like you were 8 years old again, describing something impossible and beautiful. Why should that stay a dream?" James felt something crack in his chest, the last protective wall around dreams he'd abandoned decades ago. "That would cost everything we have left," Linda finished. "Good. Let's do it anyway." They sat together as darkness fell, planning impossible buildings and possible futures, while Grace slept peacefully between them. Somewhere in the city below, another woman might be trapped, afraid, desperate for someone to notice her suffering. Because of one decision in a parking garage, because one man chose courage over convenience, a network now existed to catch her when she fell. The millionaire CEO who'd rescued a pregnant woman had done something truly shocking. He'd proven that wealth meant nothing until it was spent on something worth more than money itself. What would you have done in James's position? Share your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us what really matters.